Chapter 3. The Jockey Syndrome. The Dilemma of Exclusion. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with the forced labor, and they built Python and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. Exodus chapter 1, verses 11, 12. Isaac Murphy woke up in the saddle of exalted fame and notoriety. The date was June 26, 1890, a day after the 29-year-old jockey rode to immortality on the strong, broad shoulders of a fire-breathing colt named Salvatore at New York's Coney Island Racecourse. Murphy had already won what racing aficionados described as one of the greatest races of the previous decade, and he was already one of the most popular athletes in an emerging professional sports culture, which saw bicycling become a national craze and baseball the budding pastime. But with horse racing still king, this day's race victory had solidified him as king of the hill. Murphy made his riding debut in 1875 at age 14, just 5 days after the inaugural Kentucky Derby. 13 of the 15 riders in that first Derby were black, including the winner, Oliver Lewis. That was a year of great promise for black jockeys and for African Americans in general. It was the year Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which outlawed the exclusion of Negroes from hotels, theaters, railroads, and other public accommodations, a major, if temporary, victory. Within the next 15 years, Murphy, an African American, had become a celebrity. His face, with its handsome, chiseled features, was known at every racetrack in the country. More than 25,000 roaring horse racing fans packed the Coney Island course that Saturday afternoon, not just to see a monumental showdown between two outstanding horses, Salvatore and Tenny, but to watch two of the country's best jockeys fight a battle of wits and skill. For nearly a decade, there had been heated national debates over who was better, and therefore the best: the cool, unflappable Murphy, or the flamboyant snapper Garrison, his opponent in the saddle. Murphy had a gunslinger's reputation. He was known as a big-time winner in big-time races. During a career that lasted nearly 20 years, Murphy rode in every important derby, every classic stakes race, every important race everywhere. The bigger the race, the tougher Murphy was to beat. Garrison was the young star of the industry and the best rider in a group of white jockeys challenging deep-rooted African-American dominance in the sport. He was the White Hope before the term was coined. The battle between Murphy and Garrison contained the combustible elements of a historic match: great horses, great riders, high stakes, and racial tension. Newspapers sent their best reporters to the race and commissioned artists to recreate the dramatic moments of a race that was seen as the next symbolic showdown between black and white. For many whites, a Garrison victory would confirm the caginess, guile, and daring that supposedly framed white supremacy. For African Americans, the race was simply one more symbolic venue to prove that African Americans could excel when the playing field was level. Competition was on a level playing field. Symbolism aside, Murphy and Garrison were much more alike than different. Both riders had a flair for the dramatic, and both had been chided by the media for it. Garrison was so acclaimed for his dramatic races and comebacks that his home stretch rush became known as a Garrison finish. The Spirit of the Times, a popular newspaper of the day, reported on Garrison's inordinate desire to ride a grandstand finish, in which respect he is very much like Isaac Murphy. Garrison wants to win by a nose or an eyelash, if possible, as that satisfies best the vanity which is the dominating feature of this man's makeup. Likewise, the New York Tribune complained about Murphy's penchant for gallery finishes. The paper noted that if Murphy was in a race he knew he could win, his strategy was to lounge along in the rear of the field till he strikes the home stretch and comes in range of the clear vision of admirers in the grandstand. Murphy would then move up and dramatically poke his horse's nose in front of the lead horse he had overtaken. He proceeds to hold it there in the most artistic way till both horses pass the judges. It is the height of Murphy's ambition to ride such a finish. Murphy's greatest gift, aside from knowing how to handle the media, was his exquisite sense of pace and timing. Perhaps his greatest skill, a mandatory skill for African Americans at the time, was the ability to size up a situation quickly and adapt. At Coney Island that June morning, Murphy sent Salvatore off like a firecracker, knowing it would take a Herculean effort from Garrison and Tenney to catch him. Salvatore finished the first mile in record time, then set a record for the next eighth of a mile, leaving Garrison and Tenney hopelessly behind. Or so it appeared. Garrison's performance in the race's last 100 yards, part miracle, part work of art, was a blend of the heart and heroism that converts events into legend. Garrison frantically, mercilessly used his whip. Tenney exploded and closed what seconds earlier had seemed like an unbridgeable gap. A writer would say in the next day's paper that the manner in which Garrison drove Tenney so close on Salvatore was perfectly stupendous. Before delirious thousands, Tenney thundered down the stretch and to the naked eye appeared to catch Salvatore at the wire. A photograph taken on the spot showed that Salvatore had won by a nose. The photograph itself was worth 1,000 words, for it not only showed Salvatore's dramatic margin of victory, but captured the essence of two great jockeys. There was Garrison, bent over, frozen in his monkey crouch, in the last split second of a great race, frantically flailing. There was Murphy, sitting coolly upright and proper in his English seat, oblivious of the raging storm rapidly approaching from his right rear. They called Murphy the Machine, and this photo captured his stoic essence, cool, unflappable control. Murphy's victory capped 3 years of escalating fame, notoriety, and wealth. At the start of those 3 years, Murphy bought 7 acres of land, and he and his wife moved into a large home in a fashionable part of Lexington, Kentucky. He also bought land in Chicago. When fellow jockey Tony Hamilton was married, Murphy gave a grand reception at his house. The local paper called the reception the social event of the year in Black Lexington. One paper said that Murphy entertained more often than any black man in the South, if not in the whole country. In 1889, Murphy bought a colt and sold him for $4,000 and began a small stable of his own. An impeccable dresser, Murphy was always accompanied by a young white valet during the racing season. Murphy bought diamonds for his wife and was often bedecked with diamonds himself. While large numbers of African Americans in the South eked out a living, Murphy lived deliciously. At the end of those 3 years, Murphy was one of the highest paid athletes in the country. His annual income ranged between $15,000 and $20,000, nearly more than the entire payroll of the Chicago White Stockings baseball team. Other top jockeys of the day made between $5,000 and $6,000. Even this was a healthy salary, considering the average worker made between $500 and $1,000 a year, a figure that would plummet in 1893 when the nation plunged into a depression. Though this was not the norm, many of the best black jockeys, like their professional basketball counterparts a century later, earned salaries, and enjoyed notoriety unthinkable to fellow African Americans, particularly in the South. What would Murphy have said if someone had told him, as he basked in the glow of his Coney Island success, that black jockeys were racing toward extinction? If the response of contemporary black athletes is any indication, he probably would have laughed in his questioner's face. During the course of conducting interviews for this book and in casual conversations, black athletes routinely said without hesitation that they thought the likelihood of such a black vanishing act was virtually impossible. The black presence in contemporary sport has become so well defined, so deeply entrenched over the past 50 years, that many fans, both black and white, as well as players, feel the current situation always was and always will be. Even as the NBA actively grooms as many non-black players as it can, players from Europe or Asia, players who don't bring along with them all the street baggage of black stars, Grant Hill sees the idea as preposterous. People are too used to seeing the game played at a certain level, Hill has said. The league needs us. That's what Isaac Murphy thought. Within 20 years of Murphy's defining victory, the black jockey, a dominant presence beginning with the quarter-mile match races of the 17th and 18th centuries, would have all but disappeared. Murphy would have been hard-pressed to predict or imagine the reason for this disappearance. It wasn't because black jockeys grew too physically big, or because of any exodus from the South to the promised land of the North, or because blacks gravitated to more prestigious occupations. African American jockeys disappeared because of a confluence of powerful forces, owners and trainers who stopped hiring them, white jockeys who ganged up on them, and the jockey club that systematically denied the re-enlisting of blacks. Black riders became victims of the jockey syndrome, or changing the rules to fit a need. The need to maintain control in the face of a perceived challenge to white supremacy. The jockey syndrome is distinguished by a changing of the rules of the game when competition begins to gain ground. It usually involves a series of maneuvers to facilitate racist outcomes, including the taking away of previously granted rights and the diluting of access through coercive power and force, a phenomenon that was common outside of sports as well, of course. Black Americans would see that clearly when the Civil Rights Act they celebrated in 1875 was almost completely overturned by the Plessy v. Ferguson case of 1890. The jockey syndrome has been the primary mechanism in American sports for tilting the ostensibly level playing field of sport away from equal opportunity and toward white supremacy. In short, the conspicuous success of black jockeys led to their demise. The black stronghold on the sport had deep roots. The legacy of black riders and trainers formed an unbroken chain of dramas that extended back to the Revolutionary War, when black trainers, grooms, and riders not only cared for their masters' horses, but also hid them from invading British troops. Most of the grooms, riders, and trainers were slaves, and former slaves, who earned various levels of independence through their skill at handling horses. Like most aspects of Southern plantation life, the antebellum racing industry in America could not have survived without a black presence. Slaves and former slaves rose to prominence as jockeys and trainers. The 1890s marked the end of interracial sports in the United States at a time when the African American presence was under attack at nearly every other level of society as well. The period between 1890 and 1915 marked the most repressive and violent period in the history of race relations in the United States. Post-Reconstruction America was brutal for African Americans, who witnessed a furious backlash of white rage against gains made by African Americans after the Civil War. By 1890, black jockeys, while not the overwhelming force they had been before the Civil War, were still a dominant force. Prior to the outbreak of the war, black jockeys were an indispensable part of the racing tapestry in the United States, especially in the South, where the majority of African Americans lived and where horse racing was king. Beginning in the 18th century, when quarter horse racing was the dominant form of racing in the United States, black jockeys were involved in the most significant matches in the sport. Quarter racing was a unique American invention. Because the eastern seaboard was densely wooded, Americans would clear a pair of adjacent paths through the pine trees. These paths were anywhere from 10 to 24 feet wide, but always a quarter-mile long. As many as 20 times a day on some properties, two horses would bolt down these two paths at full throttle, jockeys jostling each other as they sped past spectators cheering wildly. This new sport was called quarter racing, and its headquarters on the Virginia-North Carolina border was dubbed the Racehorse Region. The vast black population of the region accounted for the majority of riders. Because trainers and riders spent so much time with horses as part of their natural chores on the farm and plantation, they often developed a rapport with the animals that translated into stellar performances. The first outstanding quarter horse jockey was a slave named Austin Carter. Carter was probably the best quarter horse jockey, trainer, and groom in the country. With racing centered in the South, the majority of riders from the late 1600s to the Civil War were slaves. Although popular in the North, horse racing became wildly popular in the South. As large tracks were built throughout the South, black slave riders became a sorely needed source of labor to race, train, and care for the horses. An interesting aspect of the treatment of black jockeys is that not only were they dominant, but they enjoyed a reputation for honesty and integrity, a reputation inconsistent with the virulent attacks on the black character outside the track. At a time when blacks were being demonized as beasts and rapists, black jockeys were being praised for their character. One Spirit of the Times writer said, "In the colored ranks are to be found jockeys of the most sterling honesty and integrity." Another writer, protesting the suspension of a black rider, lavished praise on him, saying he wanted to recognize the jockey's ability combined with thorough honesty, without regard to race, color, or previous condition of servitude. By the late 19th century, the dominance of black riders had become an issue. A year before Murphy's glorious Coney Island race, this headline appeared in the New York Herald, the day after African American jockeys won all 6 races in Brooklyn. "Colored jockeys show the way." In one section, the writer observed, "The sons of Ham outrode the children of Japhet with a vengeance, for not a single white boy was successful in guiding a winner past the judges." It was a field day for the dusky riders, and they forced their Caucasian competitors to take positions in the background. An 1890 headline in the Spirit of the Times declared, "All the best jockeys of the West are colored." So dominant had black riders become by 1890 that racing writers were looking for various white hopes to break the seeming lock that black riders had on the industry. An article in Harper's Weekly in 1887 pointed out hopefully that a quartet of white riding stars was emerging at the New Brooklyn Jockey Club track. The professional jockeys some years ago were Southern Negroes, and with the exception of a few cross-country riders of Irish patronage, monopolized nearly all the mounts. Today it is different. With McLaughlin, Garrison, Luke, and Andrew McCarthy, a quartet equal to any in the world, there is but little doubt that if a horse has got it in him to win, he will have to do it with one of them on his back. Why didn't African American jockeys initially encounter as much resistance as did successive waves of baseball players, cyclists, and heavyweight boxers? Perhaps diminutive jockeys were not a threat to the order. In fact, in many ways, they affirmed the imperial order. During the early decades of the sport, condescending attitudes prevented owners from appreciating the value of trainers and jockeys to the success of their horses. For many owners, until the 1850s, jockeys were anonymous sacks of weight that horses carried. With the emergence of a slave jockey named Abe Hawkins in the 1850s, owners realized that the trainers and jockeys who had the best rapport with horses had the best chance of winning and bringing the highest return on their investment. Famous for his honesty and professionalism, Hawkins was lauded for his cleverness as well as his skill in the saddle. While slave jockeys, including Hawkins, were not afforded the dignity of having their first and last name used, they were allowed public praise. Hawkins was the first to be lavished with platitudes by newspapers like the New York Herald and the Spirit of the Times. After one race, the Spirit gushed, "To extraordinary patience and judgment, Abe adds marvelous strength and skill, with a clip of the knees and thighs that incorporate him with the horse, and arms that never tire. He always has his colt right by the head, and directs unremitting observation to what others are doing. His sagacity is greatly relied on by the gentlemen who know him," said the writer Robert Alexander. "I have seen the best jockeys in Europe, and not one of them is nearly the equal of that old darky." Another called Hawkins the greatest rider in the South, while a third praised his extraordinary patience and judgment. The rise of Hawkins represented a significant shift in the elevation of jockeys in general, and of black jockeys in particular. Hawkins, more than any jockey before him, inspired an epiphany among owners regarding the importance of the jockey and the trainer to the success of the horse, namely, that the investment in horse flesh was meaningless unless the animals were well trained and expertly ridden. Hawkins, who rode throughout the Civil War period, represents the point at which African Americans began to be portrayed as accomplished athletes with strong character, discipline, and broad knowledge of racing strategies. At a time when African Americans were widely regarded as beasts and animals, some of the accomplished black athletes were marginally being portrayed as human beings. Hawkins' proficiency forced the racing public to see the importance of the jockey. Thanks to Hawkins' insights, as relayed by reporters, racing fans gained keen insight into the racing tactics of top riders. Bettors began betting on the jockey, not the horse. This new attitude toward racing and jockeys elevated the diminutive riders to star status in the United States. The new breed of racetrack gamblers placed their money in the belief that a clever jockey could win even on a second-rate mount. White riders generally did not challenge the black jockey's preeminence because of the stigma attached to working at the same job as an African American. After emancipation, African Americans monopolized certain jobs, becoming jockeys, caterers, bathhouse keepers, tailors, butchers, coachmen, barbers, and delivery boys, jobs that required little capital and depended on white customers. These jobs were closely identified with jobs performed on antebellum plantations by slaves. According to historian David Wiggins, slaves had been exploited as jockeys by the Southern planter. The position of a black who rode for wealthy racing stables after the Civil War was quite similar to that of a slave who rode for his master. Wiggins said, "The black jockeys were hirelings who rode primarily for someone else's business. So long as blacks were slaves, so long as they posed no threat to the political and economic supremacy of whites, people were content to live with them on equal terms of relative intimacy. But when the slave became a citizen, when he got a ballot in his hand and learned to read, there were demands for laws and arrangements that would humiliate him and keep him in his place. In horse racing, they needn't have bothered. Many of the jockeys kept themselves in place. Even after the Civil War, Hawkins remained loyal to his former owner, Duncan Kenner. He was grateful to Kenner for giving him an opportunity to ride horses and see the country, and Kenner was no doubt grateful to his former slave for helping to build his fortune. At one point, when Kenner's fortunes were declining, Hawkins sent word that he would lend Kenner money to tide him over. Kenner, touched by the gesture of his loyal rider, declined the offer. When Hawkins became ill, he went to Kenner's plantation to die. It was the only home he really knew. The story of slave and trainer Charles Stewart offers a poignant example of how the jockey syndrome reinforces the plantation power dynamic, whereby money does not necessarily alter one's status as slave, as long as the owner is the one who controls the rules that allow that money to be made. Stewart was a slave and trainer whose extraordinary racing life underlines the freedom a black athlete could achieve even within the confines of slavery. Born in Virginia in 1808, Stewart was a rider for Colonel William R. Johnson, one of America's leading stable owners. Later, he became a trainer and a manager. Though he was wealthy as the curator of Johnson's sprawling stable, Stewart was never set free. But he had so much authority and made so much money that he felt free. He even had an agent. As slave revolts swirled around, Stewart bought, sold, and trained his owner's horses. In 1831, when Nat Turner led his historic slave revolt in nearby Southampton County, Virginia, Stewart was unconcerned and uninvolved. He was training horses. "I was just as free and independent as any gentleman in the land," he said in his memoirs. "I had my helpers and jockeys and grooms and stablemen under me. Nobody was over me." Clearly, the irony of his condition escaped Stewart. He was quote-unquote free, but could also be sold. This is precisely what had happened to Abe Hawkins, originally owned by Adam Bingaman and sold to Duncan Kenner for $2,350. Two wealthy horse owners attempted to buy Stewart from Johnson, but the owner refused their offers. Henry Clay Jr. offered $3,500. Stewart eventually worked out an arrangement with his owner in which he, Stewart, would find another owner and Johnson would agree to the sale. Stewart arranged to sell himself to Alexander Porter, a U.S. Senator from California. The sale price was $3,500. Stewart was well compensated, but he was not free. Jockeys were dependent on the land and the landed gentry. Jockeys and trainers, so thoroughly tied to the land and owners, did not capitalize on their resources in a collective way by breaking free when they had the chance and acquiring their own land and horses. It would have been difficult, but not impossible, and it would have set up a major shift in the way the business worked if they had gained control of their own highly skilled labor. Instead, they allowed whites to negotiate the terms of their freedom and were devastated when, during times of economic hardship, the spoils were taken away. As we'll see later, this pattern of dependency and non-self-sufficiency would repeat itself centuries later when blacks were dragged back into integrated sports, beginning in the late 1940s. Before Hawkins and Stewart, there was Austin Curtis, who raced in the 18th century and was the first officially recognized great black jockey. Curtis was given his freedom after decades of loyal service to his owner. Wiley Jones of North Carolina. Jones did not set Curtis's children free, however, and one of his sons was transferred to Jones's own son, although Curtis was given use of him, quote, until my son comes of age, end quote. Curtis was also given use of a nearby home and permission to clear 50 acres for cultivation. Jones's thinking was that when Curtis's son came of age, he would take control of the land. With money he earned and saved, Curtis bought another 165 acres of land in 1803 and 145 more acres in 1808. Even at this early date, black athletes were able to make a living, get a head start, when many of their fellow bondsmen were tied to the land with little or no prospects of improving their station in life. Thanks in large part to black jockeys, the profession was elevated and jockeys found themselves in a seller's market. But as this happened, white riders began replacing black riders in the saddle. By the 1880s, the financial rewards of horse racing had made riding a means of social and economic mobility for members of disadvantaged social groups of all races. Young men who might otherwise have found it impossible to move upward advanced economically and socially by becoming jockeys. Just 4 years after the great Murphy-Garrison Coney Island race in 1890, Garrison, who rode for several horse owners, including the wealthy industrialist August Belmont, made $23,500 in a single year, at the time the highest amount ever earned by a jockey in the United States. By 1900, Todd Sloan, another successful white jockey, had become known as a lavishly spending superstar, squandering millions over a 2-year period. Sloan hobnobbed with royalty, lived in the finest hotels, and traveled with 38 trucks of clothing. He changed his outfits every hour and appeared on the streets in full dress. Only since the 1890s, when white jockeys formed, quote, anti-colored unions and virtually drove black riders off the tracks, had the jockey profession attained its current respectability. The acknowledgment of the jockey's importance was the beginning of the end for the reign of black riders. By the turn of the 20th century, black jockeys were being driven out of the industry faster than the mounts they rode. A headline in a Chicago newspaper in 1900 declared, quote, "Race war is on between jockeys at local tracks," end quote. The story began, "Jealous because of the success of so many colored riders, the white boys have taken to desperate measures to put their rivals out of business." While Jimmy Lee, one of the last black jockeys to win a major sweepstakes race in 1908, was considered by the white boys acceptable. Some of his compatriots of color become a trifle cocky in their jockey rooms, especially in the East. The white boys retaliated by ganging up against the black riders on the rails. A black boy would be pocketed, thrust back in the race, or his mount would be bumped out of contention. Or a white boy would run alongside, slip a foot under a black boy's stirrup, and toss him out of the saddle. Again, while ostensibly whipping their horses, those white fellows would slash out and cut the nearest Negro rider. They nearly ran the black boys off the tracks. Isaac Murphy could not be run off the track by other jockeys. He was too revered, too respected, too good. Murphy was not so much a victim of the syndrome as its trigger. It was almost as if the powers that be determined that there would not be another Isaac Murphy. In August 1890, Murphy was suspended from riding at Monmouth Park, New Jersey, on the accusation that he had ridden while drunk. There were long-standing suspicions that Murphy was a hard drinker, but his good relationship with the media kept his problems out of public view. The Monmouth Park episode became a scandal because Murphy had been seen as a paragon of virtue, integrity, and honor. He claimed he had been drugged and began seeing a doctor. Despite these upheavals, Murphy won an unprecedented third Kentucky Derby in 1891, setting a record that would stand until 1930. He was suspended again in 1894 for being drunk. From that point on, his mounts were treated suspiciously, and owners refused to put Murphy on their best horses. If he lost, he was accused of being drunk or not putting forth sufficient effort. The proud Murphy was shattered. He told one writer, "I am disgusted with the way they treated me in the East during the summer. When I won it was all right, but when I lost, they would say, 'There's that nigger, drunk again.' I tell you, I'm disgusted and soured on the whole business." Isaac Murphy died at age 35 on February 12, 1896. His death, on Lincoln's birthday, marked the end of an era and the beginning of the end of the reign of black jockeys. The year Murphy died, the Jockey Club was formed and became the national administrative arm of the horse racing industry. Among its other responsibilities, the club licensed jockeys. In many instances, black jockeys were not relisted. That practice, along with a reluctance of white horse owners to hire black riders, and a black exodus from the South in the face of escalating violence directed at blacks there, reduced the pool of jockeys. The root of the change was greed, money, and racism. Jimmy Winkfield was the last great black rider. Winkfield rode back-to-back Kentucky Derby winners in 1901 and 1902. He left the country shortly thereafter. His daughter says he was chased out by the Klan to race in Russia and Poland, where he became a wealthy star. Ironically, he was chased from Russia during the Revolution because he was considered part of the bourgeoisie. Winkfield subsequently led a caravan of horses, women and children from Russia to Poland. He eventually moved to France, where he raced, bought a farm, and ran a successful stable. But the defining episode of Winkfield's life, one that framed the tenacity of racism, took place many years later in 1966. When Winkfield returned to the United States for what would be his final visit, he went to Louisville to attend the Kentucky Derby, his first since he won the event in 1902. The turf writers learned that Winkfield would attend the race and arranged to honor him the night before the race. But when he showed up at the hotel, Winkfield ran into Jim Crow. Because of his race, he was informed that he couldn't come through the front door. Over the years, there has been a debate over what actually happened to black riders. Sam Lacey, the late sports editor of the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, said the disappearance of black jockeys was not a hocus-pocus mystery. What made the colored boy drift away from the jockey profession which he dominated at one time? It isn't difficult to answer this one. The colored boy has not faded out of the hard boot business through any choice of his own. He was forced out, as he is in everything else, where the white man's money and influence dictate the course of events. Although horse racing presented the first widespread example of the jockey syndrome, its first victim was not a jockey, but a baseball player. The exclusion of African Americans from baseball was part of a trend as far back as the 1850s, when, quote, informal agreements among organized amateur teams barred black participants. A year before Isaac Murphy's great race at Coney Island in 1890, Moses Fleetwood Walker, a talented catcher from Ohio, played his final game in professional baseball. On the surface, Walker's exit from baseball seemed a mere drop in the bucket of America's emerging segregationist culture. But Walker's retirement was the beginning of a tidal wave that swept African American athletes out of integrated sports by the end of the 19th century. In 1884, Walker became the first African American to play Major League Baseball. 5 years later, he left baseball bitter and disillusioned, convinced that black and white Americans could not peacefully coexist in the United States. Walker became an advocate of the Back to Africa movement. He may have been the first black athlete of his stature to play an active role in the black freedom movement. Unlike horse racing, whose roots are buried deeply in the nation's raw beginning, baseball was a phenomenon of the 19th century. By the mid-1800s, baseball was making the transition from a game played on farms and lots to a highly commercial enterprise with good salaries for a select few. Baseball was among the first American sports to enter the realm of the emerging entertainment industry. The first professional baseball team was formed in 1869, the first professional league in 1876, and by the late 1880s, the game had become a commercialized amusement business. Baseball players were tied to their teams for life, or until their teams no longer needed them. But they were happy to be so chained. The pay was good and jobs were limited. The players' grateful attitude was summed up by the star player of the time, Willie Keeler, who said, "I'm thinking of these suckers, the owners paying me for playing ball. Why, I'd pay my own way if that was the only way I had to get in a ball game." Then, as now, the media took a "they should be grateful" attitude toward player salaries. The Sporting Life newspaper observed, "Columbus has a deaf mute, and Cleveland a one-armed pitcher, Toledo a colored catcher, and Providence a deaf center fielder, and yet these men can earn about $2,000 per annum apiece." At a time when laborers made less than $600 a year, a career in baseball was an attractive way to make a living. The best Negro League players were making $500 a year. By 1898, rising salaries and ferocious competition for jobs triggered the complete purge of African Americans from white-controlled baseball. One reason that Walker would be so broken by his exclusion from baseball was that he felt he was better than the average African American and should be treated as such. He was a mulatto. His mother, Caroline Walker, was a midwife, his father was a doctor and a minister, and his family lived in a large home. Walker attended Oberlin College and played on the school's first varsity baseball team. He transferred to the University of Michigan, where he played one season. In 1883, William Volz, a former sports writer, hired Fleetwood Walker to play for Toledo in the Northwestern League. During his first season, Walker had his initial encounter with a ragged version of the jockey syndrome when Cap Anson, the manager of the Chicago White Stockings of the National League, threatened not to play if Walker was allowed to play. Volz refused to concede and even sent Walker, who was scheduled to have an off day, to right field. He told Anson that if Chicago pulled out, Toledo wouldn't pay the guarantee. Anson backed down and the game was played. A year later, Walker became the first African-American player to play in the major leagues, but his entry into the game was hardly the emotional national saga that would make Jackie Robinson and Branch Rickey immortal 54 years later. There was no national search for the right black man to break the color barrier. Walker came in through the back door when Toledo, which played in the Northwestern League, was invited to join the American Association, which itself had received major league status in an agreement with the National League in 1883. At the time, other black players were playing with white minor league teams. Some all-black teams competed in the leagues as well. In Walker's case, the jockey syndrome manifested itself in a variety of ways. The covert backroom meeting of the old boys took the basic format. In 1887, International League owners agreed in a vote not to offer future contracts to black players. Then there was the more extemporaneous manifestations, such as Cap Anson's threat to Toledo. It manifested itself on the field, too. In Toledo, Walker worked with a pitcher named Tony Mullane, who conceded that he did not like blacks, but admitted that he respected Walker's ability and said Walker was the best catcher he had ever worked with. But Mullane refused to take signals from Walker, lest he allow a black man to be in a leadership capacity. Walker was the best catcher I ever worked with, but whenever I had to pitch to him, I used to pitch anything I wanted without looking at his signals. One day he signaled me for a curve, and I shot a fastball at him. He caught it and walked down to me. He said, "I'll catch you without signals, but I won't catch you if you're going to cross me when I give you signals." and all the rest of that season he caught me and caught anything I pitched without knowing what was coming. The fact that catchers didn't wear gloves in his day made Walker's task all the more remarkable. Unlike with Jackie Robinson, who would integrate modern Major League Baseball in 1946, Walker's presence did not lead to a deluge of black players or the scouring of Negro teams for black players by Major League teams. Walker lasted less than one season in the majors. He broke a rib in July 1884, was released from the Toledo team a month later, and never re-entered the major leagues. No more black players played in the major leagues until Robinson signed with Brooklyn, though there were numerous attempts, mostly by major league managers, to sign black players. The next 5 years saw Walker embark on an odyssey of trying to get back into Major League Baseball. He played with Cleveland of the Western League briefly, then with Waterbury of the Eastern League for 2 years. In 1887, Walker got a position with Newark of the International League, where he worked with a black pitcher, the great George Washington Stovey. In an exhibition game against Chicago, Walker was confronted once again by Cap Anson, who again threatened to pull his team if Walker and Stovey were allowed to play. This time, Walker's team backed down. By 1887, the climate had changed. Baseball salaries began to rise in the 1880s and into the first decade of the 1900s. There was a tremendous talent surplus brought on by the collapsed Players' League and the American Association, and this resulted in ferocious competition for jobs. Team rosters were limited to 14 players until 1897. Only 170 players could play in a given season. In 1897, the rosters expanded to 18. Owners, with the help of sports writers, constantly reinforced the idea that players should be happy and grateful. The naked truth is that had talented black players been allowed to compete, they would have taken jobs away from white players. So black players, victimized by racism on the one hand and economic-based exclusion on the other, were left out. White baseball owners, while perfectly willing to lowball white players, were not ready to use black players as a means of achieving their end. They still had a sport to build. When the International League reformed as the International Association, the jockey syndrome was still in place. The International League, for a period, had agreed not to ban black players, but to restrict them to one per team. When the Newark team folded, Walker moved to Syracuse of the International Association. Syracuse already had a black player, but was able to use a grandfather clause to get Walker onto the roster. By this time, the cumulative effect of turning the other cheek, acting in a way that made whites feel comfortable, began to eat away at Walker's renowned restraint. At a game in Syracuse, Walker took the day off and sat in the dugout in street clothes. The Toronto manager asked Walker to leave the stadium. Heated words were exchanged. According to one account, Walker was surrounded by fans and allegedly brandished a loaded revolver and threatened to put a hole in someone in the crowd. He was arrested but released, and the next day he was in Syracuse's lineup. Walker's last season of baseball was 1889. He was the last black in the International Association. As a result of that 1887 owners' meeting, no contracts were handed out to new black players. 9 years later, blacks were banned from all levels of white-controlled baseball. On April 1st, 1891, Walker was walking home from a bar when he was confronted by a group of white men. Words were exchanged. Walker pulled a knife, and a man named Patrick Murray ended up dead. Walker was tried for second-degree murder and acquitted. In 1898, Walker was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to a year in federal prison for mail theft in connection with his job as a clerk in the post office. He was released in 1900 and began work as the owner of the Steubenville Hotel in Ohio. He also managed an opera house in nearby Cadiz. In 1908, the year Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title, Walker and his brother Weldy edited a paper called The Equator. That same year, Walker wrote Our Home Colony, a treatise on the past, present, and future of the Negro race in America, a 48-page book in which Walker advocated emigration to Africa for all blacks. In the book, Walker wrote, Even forced emigration would be better for all than the continued present relations of the races. Walker felt that whites and blacks were too different to live peacefully in the same country. It's not hard to see why he'd think that, given his experiences in the sport he loved. In the end, Isaac Murphy and Moses Fleetwood Walker made fatal miscalculations in negotiating a racist sports industry. Walker, greatly influenced by his father's teachings and the prevailing attitudes of the day, felt that his privileged upbringing and his light skin, along with merit, would allow him to prevail. Murphy was simply too grateful at the beginning of his career and too blinded by opulence at the end to anticipate black riders being pushed out of horse racing. Walker's and Murphy's miscalculations define what would become the Achilles heel of African American athletes to this day: the failure to anticipate, plan, and organize. The wholesale dependence on a racist white power structure for sustenance, and surprise and consternation when the money and support are withdrawn. Just as black jockeys failed to accumulate an ownership stake in their industry, contemporary black athletes have little ownership stake and thus are vulnerable to the same jockey syndrome. In any event, Murphy and Walker were merely the tip of the iceberg of an emerging African American presence in sports. And there's no question that among some powerful white Americans, the black presence in sports was becoming a threat. At the turn of the 20th century, the prevailing wisdom among racialists was that African Americans, because of irreparable genetic deficiencies, would not survive. So for those who wished the country's Negro problem would just go away, the black athlete became an uneasy symbol of the African American's deeply rooted presence in America. This resilience was crystallized over the next century by the predominance of African American athletes in white-run sports, even under the regime of the jockey syndrome. No sooner had one star or group of stars been purged than another, usually in another sport, emerged. In 1896, the year Isaac Murphy died, a pair of 18-year-old teenagers, a boxer in Galveston, Texas, and a cyclist in Indianapolis, Indiana, embarked on respective odysseys that would propel them to international fame. One would revive his sport, the other would define it. Their presence would have a more resounding impact than Murphy's. Jack Johnson and Major Taylor stripped away the United States democratic veneer as the country embarked on a century of dominance and expansion in the name of democracy. As much as lynching and racial violence revealed the nation's bent toward violent racism, Johnson and Taylor exposed America's deep-rooted fear of the fair fight, a fear that stalked and haunted the nation, even at play. As a widening international audience weighed the United States' deeds against its pronouncements, African Americans, burnt, castrated, strung from trees, became a profound symbol of the nation's contradictions. But even when bloody evidence of racism diminished or was hidden, black athletes revealed its existence. Both Johnson and Taylor were born in 1878. Johnson on March 31st in Galveston, Taylor on November 26th outside of Indianapolis. Johnson, the third of 6 children, embarked on the independent life early on. Between the ages of 16 and 20, he trained horses, painted wagons, baked bread, and unloaded ships. Taylor grew up on the farm of a well-to-do white family for whom his father worked as a coachman. The farm owners later adopted Taylor when he was 8 to be the playmate and companion of their son. While Jack Johnson lived the rough and tumble life of a fighter in training, Taylor helped himself to large doses of the good life, alternating between the black world of the farm and family and his adopted family's world of expensive toys, upper-class values, and private tutors. When the white family left for the Midwest, they left Taylor behind, but also gave him his own late model safety bicycle, which had become all the rage. The expensive toy became Taylor's ticket to international fame. Johnson began boxing locally in Galveston and slowly gained a reputation as a nimble, skillful fighter with a mean disposition. Taylor grew up in the predominantly white world of bicycle racing. He worked in bicycle shops, one of which employed him as a mascot of sorts to do tricks on his bike, and dressed him in a soldier's uniform, thus his nickname Major. He moved in with Bertie Munger, a former cycling great who inspired Taylor's career. Under Munger's direction, Taylor was introduced to professional cycling. Despite their different upbringings and worldviews, Johnson and Taylor would be victimized similarly by the jockey syndrome, as white society became more reliant on rules and legislation to accomplish what once had been done through violence and intimidation. The two confronted the jockey syndrome in drastically different ways, with varying degrees of success. Taylor, much as he did on the velodrome, slipped through the cracks and darted through openings. Johnson, much as he did in the ring, pounded down the door. In 1890, Charles Pratt, the father of competitive cycling, sent out a call for cyclists around the country to converge on Newport, Rhode Island, for a convention. Pratt's goal was to form a national association that would put all riders under one umbrella. By the end of the week, the 5,000 cyclists had gathered and formed the League of American Wheelmen. Over the next 10 years, cycling became a fad of epidemic proportions. By 1890, there were more than 100,000 cyclists in the United States. Clubs were organized in nearly every town in the nation. There were white clubs and black clubs, clubs for women and children. A women's club in Manhattan performed intricate drills on bicycles. Everyone was riding. As bicycling became a spectator sport, velodromes were built everywhere in the United States, and large crowds came to watch the quote-unquote scorchers, as cyclists were called, shoot around the board tracks at breakneck speed. Bicycle racing was the new national craze. Racers, the daredevil heroes of the day. At that 1890 jamboree, neither Pratt nor any of the other cyclists had any idea that a humble, well-mannered 12-year-old African-American boy on a farm in Indianapolis would emerge as one of the greatest cyclists in the sport's history. Taylor won his first race in 1892 at age 13. He had gone to watch the race, but Munger, the owner of the cycling shop where he worked, insisted that he enter the 10-mile race. White riders immediately showed their resentment by barring Taylor from all city tracks in Indianapolis. Taylor dominated cycling competition during the height of the sport's popularity. By 1899, he had won the national and international championships and was the most recognized African-American athlete in the United States. Great and enduring as his legacy would be, Taylor's racing career, virtually from the beginning, was defined, framed, and circumscribed by the jockey syndrome. During the 1892 League of American Wheelmen Convention, a faction introduced legislation banning blacks from membership, but the body refused to consider the question. A year later, a similar motion was introduced to include the word white in the membership rules. That too failed to achieve a two-thirds vote. In 1893, the Associated Cycling Club of Chicago barred black riders from participating in the Pullman Road Race. At the 1894 League of American Wheelmen Convention, a motion barring blacks from membership passed out of fear, so the argument went, that the association might lose its southern chapters if integration prevailed. Black riders who were already members could remain in the association. The impetus for the vote was a letter favoring segregation, allegedly written by Frederick Scott, president of the Union Cycle Club of Louisville, the largest black cycling club in the South. Scott correctly surmised that continued segregation would strengthen his black association. Indeed, after the 1894 ruling, black racing clubs grew. Taylor joined the predominantly black Seesaw Club in Indianapolis in 1895. In 1896, Taylor received an invitation from the Capital City Cycling Club to race against the record of Walter Sanger, one of the sport's early champions. Taylor beat Sanger's record by 8.2 seconds and was subsequently banned from the track. After a hard-fought race in Massachusetts, in which Taylor finished second, the third-place finisher grabbed Taylor from behind and choked him into unconsciousness. The rider was fined, and a group of white riders took up a collection to help him pay it. In 1897, Taylor pulled out of the national circuit races because Southern promoters refused his entry when racers refused to ride against him. While the jockey syndrome tied Taylor in knots, the underlying racism of the syndrome concealed what was also at the root of his popularity. This would be the conundrum that black athletes and promoters would face for decades to come, fighting on one hand for a level playing field, yet playing on America's obsession with race to sell tickets and promote events. Taylor, like nearly every legendary athlete from Tom Molyneux to Jackie Robinson, was propelled to national and international heights of fame largely because racial tensions and combustible feelings projected into a sporting match between black and white. One writer explained, "The crowds wanted action, drama, and danger, and the struggle between Taylor and his white rivals was basic and understandable and fit the black-white hysteria of the era." Taylor was a young David taking up against several Goliaths at once. Taylor's races were filled with unstated but obvious racial symbolism. In virtually every race, he found himself competing against the field, much like black jockeys of the same era who found themselves under attack by clusters of white riders. Many of Taylor's most ingenious racing tactics were developed to overcome the often dangerous maneuvers opposing racers used against him. His best and most obvious was to get the lead early and to keep it. In this way, Taylor dominated cycling from 1898 to 1901. By the end of 1899, Europeans, especially the French, were eager to see this mysterious black champion. Taylor was a hero in France and found himself elevated to the status of superstar. He was recognized everywhere he went. Crowds waited in his hotel to ask if he had passed a good night. When he arose at 6 a.m. and went for a walk, the walk became news in the Paris papers. The staff of the sports newspaper L'Autovelo took Taylor to see Little Chocolate, the clown, the only other famous black in Paris at the time. He spent time in the Café Espérance, the cyclist hangout. Taylor, the Negro Volant, was so well known that mail addressed to Major Taylor, Paris, France, reached him. Maurice Martin, owner of L'Autovelo, took Taylor to be examined by distinguished doctors at the Academy of Sciences to test racial stereotypes of the day. The doctors found him to be absolutely perfect except for overdevelopment of thighs due to bicycle racing. A French journalist wrote to a friend in Chicago, "Not one may be compared with Taylor in the matter of politeness and good behavior. We were literally amazed to find him better educated than the average foreigner who comes over and possessed of far better manners than our own riders. When we think of some of the harsh treatment to which this man has been subjected on account of his color, we cannot refrain from uttering the strongest words of disapprobation of such acts, nor from thinking that some parts of your country must be in a state of savagery." Taylor left Paris on June 28, 1901. In 4 months, he had been in 24 races. He had taken 18 firsts, 4 seconds, and 2 thirds. He lost only 2 match races and came back to avenge those defeats. In Paris, Taylor was welcomed into the social life of the sport. There, the racism he encountered at home was replaced by curiosity and tolerance. There was ignorance of black culture and some condescension, but no hostility. For the first time in his life, he found it an advantage to be black. Taylor, like Isaac Murphy, made a lucrative living through racing. He bought a large home in a white neighborhood in Worcester, Massachusetts. In Taylor's mind, this was evidence of his elevated status. Like Moses Fleetwood Walker, Taylor felt that his home, his standard of living, and the respect he received from the white community separated him from the typical Negro. In retirement, Taylor never filled the void created by the end of his legendary career. Cycling died out as an American passion around 1902, and what also died out was the notion of Taylor as an American hero. He was just another black man who had happened to have once been an athlete. Taylor had a penchant for invention and felt he only needed formal education to flesh out his skills. Yet, despite his accomplishments, Taylor was refused admission to Worcester Polytechnic Institute, supposedly because he did not have a high school diploma. His daughter, Sydney, and his wife, Daisy, subsequently watched venture after venture fold. He was a racer, his daughter recalled, not a businessman. When the major Taylor Manufacturing Company folded, Taylor lost $15,000. A motor oil business also failed. He was a salesman in 1917, a machinist in 1918, and a partner in a firm called Taylor & Quick the following year. Between 1922 and 1924, he owned the Major Taylor Tire Shop. In 1926, he was listed as an auto repairer. The jockey syndrome shaved precious years from the athlete's sports life and real life, creating as it did the stress and frustration of knowing that whatever heights one attained might have been higher, but for the pressures of racial animosity and the silent spike of discrimination operating in high places. The most devastating effect of the jockey syndrome, regardless of the generation it strikes, is how it eats away not simply at the victim, but at the victim's family relationships. I met Sydney Taylor Brown some time ago, when we sat in her Pittsburgh home and talked well into the evening about her father and the meaning of his life. She recalled the fanfare surrounding her father's races, and being made to feel special because she was Major Taylor's daughter. They were not close. He discouraged her from becoming a physical education instructor because people might think she was a lesbian. He admonished her for going out without a hat on a sun-baked day, lest she get dark. For his part, Taylor attended a black church, but was not really of the people. Said Taylor Brown, "I don't think he was proud to be a Negro." Her father respected Jack Johnson's triumphs over racism, but did not like Johnson's outrageousness, his cavorting with white women and openly living the fast life at a time when blacks were expected to be seen, not heard. As with Moses Fleetwood Walker, the source of Taylor's indignation over race did not stem from his pride as a black man. He resented not being allowed to become part of the fraternity of white men, as other ethnic groups had done. As his fame evaporated piece by precious piece, Taylor sold all the material markers of his fame. Diamonds, necklaces, furniture. Finally came the most crushing blow. He sold his home and moved his family into an apartment. In 1930, his wife left him, taking their daughter and moved to New York. Taylor was crushed by the specter of failure and could not stay in Worcester. He left for Chicago, where he died in 1932 after a lingering illness. He was buried in a pauper's cemetery. Sydney did not learn of her father's death until her husband received a copy of his obituary that appeared in the Chicago Defender. A larger obituary appeared in Paris, the scene of his great international triumphs. Taylor was devastated by his sharp descent. He had been a famous athlete and treated with such respect, I'm sure that was very hard for him to handle. his daughter recalled. She reflected on what it must have been like to be an African American athlete, living so large one moment and sinking to such depths in the next. Only as an adult had she realized the enormous pressure her father must have been under to be successful, to contend with racism, swallow his pride, and then watch his famine crumble before him, losing his money and his health, and his wife and his daughter. I think it was too much, she said. I think it was a shame that he had to end like that. I didn't realize it then, because I was always mad with him. But I sure do wish I would have called him back and said, Daddy, I didn't understand what it must have been like to be a black man back in those days. I feel terrible to think that he died alone in the hospital. Jack Johnson's timing was always superb. Just as he was mastering his craft as a boxer, the nation was hungry for a fight. The infatuation with cycling had faded, and Americans wanted something more physically direct. Boxing surfaced as the sport of the moment. Velodromes were converted into boxing arenas. Boxing was a fitting sport for a nation beginning to sow its international oats. Prize fighting thrived because the sport helped to satisfy the rapidly growing urban audience for commercial spectacles. By 1900, the sport of boxing not only attracted its traditional rowdy core audience, but it was gaining support from respectable people who once scorned the sport. This was an era of muscle flexing and rugged competition in politics and business. Boxing was a human drama that reduced the values of American society to a pair of gladiators. More than any other sport, it spanned the gulf between rich and poor, upper and lower classes, because in its raw primal violence and drive toward domination, it captured the spirit of the age. As one commentator wrote, there is in every man a trace of original savagery, and it is probably no worse to gratify this by looking at a fight than by scolding one's wife, kicking the family cat, or trying to bulldoze a legislature in the interests of Tammany. Unlike Taylor, who enjoyed a meteoric rise from 1894 to 1900, Johnson took the long road. When Arthur John Jack Johnson was born, the United States was mired in depression. Though his hometown of Galveston was prosperous, his fighting career was inspired by his mother, who, after he lost a schoolboy fight, told him that if he was beaten again, he'd get a worse whipping at home. Johnson's first taste of organized fighting came in humiliating battle royals. These were a form of boxing that were more racist ritual than sport. They took the form of young blacks fighting each other in a ring in front of white spectators, who threw coins to the victor. These spectacles were very much like the plantation fights in Tom Molyneux's days, when neighboring owners would pit their black slaves against each other. After leaving school, Johnson trained horses, painted wagons, baked bread, and unloaded ships. By the time he reached his late teens, he was locked into a profession as a fighter. He worked as a sparring partner and sometimes fought circus boxers. By 1899, he was defeating the best of the local fighters. After beating Jim McCormick, he decided to try Chicago. In 1901, he got a chance to fight Joe Choinsky, a great fighter past his prime but still respected. Before the event, black minstrels and a quartet sang some songs. This was followed by a battle royal between two one-legged colored boys. The referee gave a speech about maintaining order during the interracial main event. Then Johnson's bout began, and in the third round, Choinsky knocked Johnson out. Immediately after the bout, the fighters were arrested. White boxing fans were uncomfortable, particularly in the South, with interracial matches. In 1897, an interracial fight was stopped by Henry Long, who said, "The idea of niggers fighting white men. Why, if that darn scoundrel would beat that white boy, the niggers would never stop gloating over it. And as it is, we have enough trouble with them." But unlike cycling and baseball, boxing was not protected by the jockey syndrome. Those sports were tightly organized and lent themselves to backroom manipulation to change the rules when needed. Boxing, however, depended on individual fighters to, quote, draw the color line. John L. Sullivan, the first great nationally acclaimed fighter, vigorously defended the color line. In this challenge, I include all fighters, first come, first serve, who are white. I will not fight a Negro. I never have and I never shall. He never did, nor did his successor, Jim Corbett. The emergence of Jack Johnson was for many whites an embodiment of the great American nightmare, a bold, independent African American, competing for a job on a level playing field. As one writer observed, with money in his pockets, physical triumph over white men in his heart, he displayed all the gross and overbearing insolence which makes what we call the black nigger insufferable. Johnson won a shot at the championship in part because there was relatively little money in boxing at the time. Jim Jeffries retired largely because the sport was bankrupt. When Tommy Burns won the championship in 1906, Johnson stalked him literally across the face of the earth, first to London, then to Australia. There Burns relented in the face of the biggest payday of his career. The electricity of race, black man, white man, would again guarantee a huge gate. There was more at stake than the title of pugilistic champion of the world. Australians had a long history of racism against their own brown-skinned inhabitants. When Truganini, the last Tasmanian, died in 1876, the Hobart Mercury editorialized, "I regret the death of the last of the Tasmanian Aborigines, but I know that it is the result of the fiat that the black shall everywhere give place to the white." The sentiment was not borne out by the fight. By 6 a.m., 5 hours before the scheduled start of the fight, there was a crowd of 5,000 waiting at the gate. When Johnson entered the ring before a full house of 20,000, there were a few cheers, but mostly catcalls and racial epithets. The fight was a mismatch. The writer Jack London described the fight as one between a colossus, Johnson, and a toy automaton, between a playful Ethiopian and a futile white man, between a grown man and a naughty child. Much like the Molyneux Crib fight 100 years earlier, racial stereotypes were smashed that afternoon. Burns was counting on the scientific beliefs of the day. The blacks had no endurance, hard heads and weak stomachs. Only those races from northern climates had the stamina for a long boxing match. Johnson won the fight in the 14th round. Burns was led away, dazed, confused with blood, but still game, screaming for the police to give him another chance. Jack Johnson had become the first black heavyweight champion of the world in Australia. Johnson's victory set off national hysteria in the United States that revived boxing, as armadas of white men responded to Jack London's call for a white hope. Johnson successfully defended his title against Jim Jeffries in 1910. When he entered the ring to fight Jeffries, the band began playing "All Coons Look Alike to Me," a minstrel song written 4 years earlier by Ernest Hogan, who was black. After the fight, riots broke out throughout the United States. 8 blacks were killed by roving gangs of whites. Yet, Johnson became the ultimate victim of the jockey syndrome. When the color line was not enough to contain black momentum, powerful forces dug deeper. The government began its pursuit of Johnson in 1912, when the mother of an 18-year-old white woman pressed abduction charges against him. The Federal Bureau of Investigation enthusiastically pressed for a Mann Act conviction. The case fell through, but the government continued to dig until it found a former lover who gave damaging evidence and testimony. A grand jury voted to indict. Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who as baseball commissioner years later would play a key role in keeping blacks out of baseball, quickly issued a warrant for Johnson's arrest, charging him with transporting Belle Schreiber from Pittsburgh to Chicago for the purpose of prostitution and debauchery. Johnson's subsequent marriage to his young white lover inflamed public opinion against him and incited one Southern congressman to call for a constitutional amendment that would prevent white women from being, quote, corrupted by a strain of kinky-headed blood, end quote. Johnson refused to back down, even in the face of criticism from segments of the black community and practically the entire white community. His bold demeanor on the stand reinforced his image as a bad nigger. Johnson was sentenced to 1 year and a day in prison. The Mann Act had been successful. A New York Core writer observed, Johnson is black and has more money than is good for a black man. The Department of Justice must aid the white hopes in taking away the superfluous cash of the stupidly brazen Negro pugilist. Anglo-Saxon America is relieved of a most dangerous menace to the preservation of its color. End quote. Johnson fled the country in 1913 and sailed to Europe, where he remained a fugitive for 7 years. In 1915, he agreed to a title fight against Jess Willard in Cuba. The lingering and unproven theory surrounding the fight was that in exchange for losing, he would be granted clemency in the States. Johnson lost the title to Willard, and while no clemency was granted, the virulent anti-black violence that had begun so abruptly and intensely in 1890 subsided, as if Johnson's defeat were a reassuring sign of white dominance reasserting itself. After the 1915 fight, Johnson went to England, Spain, and Mexico before returning to the United States, where he served 8 months of his term. Johnson didn't go out meekly, but the same way he came in, loudly. He was killed in a car accident in 1946, the same year Jackie Robinson signed a major league contract to make him the first African American to reach the big leagues since Moses Fleetwood Walker in 1884. Like Jackie Robinson, Joe Louis, and Muhammad Ali, Johnson had enjoyed incredible longevity. Ali in his prime kept Johnson's name alive and often invoked Johnson as a model for his own audacity. But there would not be another black heavyweight champion until 1937, when Joe Louis defeated James Braddock. Even then, Louis and his managers had to make sure the public was reassured that he was no Jack Johnson, at least not in public. Johnson became the archetype of racial confrontation in sport. Hysteria over his emergence and triumphs created the notion of the Great White Hope, which still exists both as a metaphor and a reality. In the early 20th century's turbulence, including the rapid formation and collapsing of sports leagues and the exodus of black athletes from white sports, a young pitcher from Calvert, Texas, named Arthur Foster began to make a name for himself. Foster would be more of a visionary than Johnson, Isaac Murphy, Major Taylor, or even Moses Fleetwood Walker, who became a proponent of the Back to Africa movement. After years of watching talented black players get rebuked, denied, pushed out, and frustrated, Foster had a new vision of a promised land. In Foster's view, the promised land was not white leagues, but self-sufficiency. Foster agreed with Walker's premise that blacks would never have a fair break so long as they were dependent on the largesse of whites. But he disagreed that the only way to rectify the situation was to return to Africa. Foster was convinced that this rapidly growing tribe of black athletes could create a homeland of its own. Foster's focus was baseball. His promised land was the Negro Leagues.